Hello, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Ava, aka Queen Midas, Life Alchemist, and I am here for another installment of Weekend Book Club. We are going through The Body Keeps the Score, so we're going to be continuing through this. This book is written by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD. And if this is your first time joining me for this book club, I would suggest that you go back and start with week 1 because that is the beginning of the book. Also, if you would like to purchase your own copy of the book, it's not necessary at all. I do have a link posted in the description box below. So this installment is a little bit late. I have recorded this week 3 several days ago, got to the editing process and realized that my sound was all crackly. So, and I was in the middle of traveling and I didn't have a time to re-record until now. So you will be getting 2 weekend book clubs this week because I owe you week 3. So really quickly, my Calendly booking link is in the description box below. If you are wanting to meet with me for tarot guidance readings. Also, I do have all of my tarot decks that I use listed in the description box below as well. So I believe that is all. Let's go ahead and get started. Oh, and happy belated Father's Day. I did say happy Father's Day when I recorded this, but yeah, that recording didn't end up getting posted. So happy belated Father's Day, everybody. All right. So we are starting with chapter 3. This says looking into the brain, the neuroscience revolution. And it starts off with a quote from Ivan Pavlov. If we could look through the skull into the brain of a consciously thinking person, and if the place of optimal excitability were luminous, then we should see playing over the cerebral surface a bright spot with fantastic waving borders constantly fluctuating in size and form, and surrounded by darkness, more or less deep, covering the right of the hemisphere. And there's another quote here by Yogi Berra. It says, "You observe a lot by watching." All right, and now we are starting the chapter. In the early 1990s, novel brain imaging techniques opened up undreamed of capacities to gain a sophisticated understanding about the way the brain processes information. Gigantic multi-million-dollar machines based on advanced physics and computer technology rapidly made neuroscience into one of the most popular areas for research. Positron emission tomography, or PET, and later functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, enabled scientists to visualize how different parts of the brain are activated when people are engaged in certain tasks or when they remember events from the past. For the first time, we could watch the brain as it processed memories, sensations, and emotions and begin to map the circuits of mind and consciousness. The earlier technology of measuring brain chemicals like serotonin or norepinephrine had enabled scientists to look at what fueled neural activity, which is a bit like trying to understand a car's engine by studying gasoline. Neuroimaging made it possible to see inside the engine. By doing so, it has also transformed our understanding of trauma. Harvard Medical School was and is at the forefront of the neuroscience revolution. And in 1994, a young psychiatrist, Scott Rausch, was appointed as the first director of the Massachusetts General Hospital Neuroimaging Laboratory. After considering the most relevant questions that this new technology could answer and reading some articles I had written, Scott asked me whether I thought we could study what happens in the brains of people who have flashbacks. I had just finished a study on how trauma is remembered, to be discussed in chapter 12. In which patients repeatedly told me how upsetting it was to be suddenly hijacked by images, feelings, and sounds from the past. When several said they had wished they knew what trick their brains were playing on them during these flashbacks, I asked 8 of them if they would be willing to return to the clinic and lie still inside a scanner, an entirely new experiment that I described in detail, while we recreated a scene from the painful events that haunted them. To my surprise, All 8 agreed, many of them expressing their hope that what we learned from their suffering could help other people. My research assistant, Rita Fizzler, who was working with us prior to entering Harvard Medical School, sat down with every participant and carefully constructed a script that recreated their trauma moment to moment. We deliberately tried to collect just isolated fragments of their experience, particular images, sounds, and feelings, rather than the entire story, because that is how trauma is experienced. Rita also asked the participants to describe a scene where they felt safe and in control. Excuse me. One person described her morning routine, another sitting on the couch of a farmhouse in Vermont overlooking the hills. We would use this script for a second scan to provide a baseline measurement. After the participants checked the scripts for accuracy, reading silently, which is less overwhelming than hearing or speaking, Rita made a voice recording that would be played back to them while they were in the scanner. A typical script. You are 6 years old and getting ready for bed. You hear your mother and father yelling at each other. You are frightened and your stomach is in a knot. You and your younger brother and sister are huddled at the top of the stairs. You look over the banister and see your father holding your mother's arms while she struggles to free herself. Your mother is crying, spitting, and hissing like an animal. Your face is flushed and you feel hot all over. When your mother frees herself, she runs to the dining room and breaks a very expensive Chinese vase. You yell at your parents to stop, but they ignore you. Your mom runs upstairs and you hear her breaking the TV. Your little brother and sister try to get her to hide in the closet. Your heart pounds and you are trembling. At this first session, we explained the purpose of the radioactive oxygen that patients would be breathing. As any part of the brain became more or less metabolically active, its rate of oxygen consumption would immediately change, which would be picked up by the scanner. We would monitor their blood pressure and heart rate throughout the procedure so that these physiological signs could be compared with brain activity. Several days later, the participants came to the imaging lab. Marcia, a 40-year-old school teacher from a suburb outside of Boston, was the first volunteer to be scanned. Her script took her back to the day 13 years earlier when she picked up her 5-year-old daughter, Melissa, from day camp. As they drove off, Marcia heard a persistent beeping indicating that Melissa's seatbelt was not properly fastened. When Marcia reached over to adjust the belt, she ran a red light. Another car smashed into hers from the right, instantly killing her daughter. In the ambulance on the way to the emergency room, the 7-year-old fetus Marcia was carrying also died. Overnight, Marcia had changed from a cheerful woman who was the life of the party into a haunted and depressed person filled with self-blame. She moved from a classroom teaching into school administration because working directly with children had become intolerable. As for many parents who have lost their children, their happy laughter became a powerful trigger. Even hiding behind her paperwork, she could barely make it through the day. In a futile attempt to keep her feelings at bay, she coped by working day and night. Instead of standing outside the scanner as Marcia underwent the procedure I was standing outside the scanner as Marcia underwent the procedure and could follow her physiological reactions on a monitor. The moment we turned on the tape recorder, her heart started to race and her blood pressure jumped. Simply hearing the script activated the same physiological responses that had occurred during the accident 13 years earlier. After the recorded script concluded and Marcia's heart rate and blood pressure returned to normal, we played her second script, getting out of bed and brushing her teeth. This time her heart rate and blood pressure did not change. As she emerged from the scanner, Marcia looked defeated, drawn out, and frozen. Her breath was shallow, her eyes were open wide, and her shoulders were hunched. The very image of vulnerability and defenselessness. We tried to comfort her, but I wondered if whatever we discovered would be worth the price of her distress. After all 8 participants completed the procedure, Scott Roush went to work with his mathematicians and statisticians to create composite images that compared the arousal created by a flashback with the brain in neutral. After a few weeks, he sent me the results, which you see above. I taped the scans up on the refrigerator in my kitchen, and for the next few months, I stared at them every morning. It occurred to me that this is how early astronomers must have felt when they peered through a telescope at a new constellation. There were some puzzling dots and colors on the scan, but the biggest area of the brain activation, a large red spot in the right lower center of the brain, which is the limbic area or emotional brain, came as no surprise. It was already known that intense emotions activate the limbic system, in particular, an area within it called the amygdala. We depend on the amygdala to warn us of impending danger and to activate the body's stress response. Our study clearly showed that when traumatized people were presented with images, sounds, or thoughts related to their particular experience, the amygdala reacts with alarm, even as in Marcia's case, 13 years after the event. Activation of this fear center triggers the cascade of stress hormones and nerve impulses that drive up blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen intake, preparing the body for fight or flight. The monitors attached to Marcia's arms recorded this physiological state of frantic arousal, even though she never totally lost track of the fact that she was resting quietly in the scanner. Okay, and there's 3 pictures here, so I'm going to show you. The first one is A. So A shows, these are all pictures of the brain on trauma. Photograph A shows the bright spots on the limbic brain. So here, this is the limbic brain right there. Photograph B shows the visual cortex being lit up, and it shows heightened activation as well. So here, the visual cortex down there is lit up. And then on C, the brain speech center shows markedly decreased activation, which is interesting because that kind of makes sense to me. You know, some people freeze when they're in fear or like heightened trauma, they can't speak. So that makes sense. Oh, and the next section is called speechless horror. Okay. Our most surprising finding was a white spot in the left frontal lobe of the cortex in a region called Broca's area. In this case, the change in color meant that there was a significant decrease in that part of the brain. Broca's area is one of the speech centers of the brain, which is often affected in stroke patients when the blood supply to that region is cut off. Without a functioning Broca's area, you cannot put your thoughts and feelings into words. Our scans showed that Broca's area went offline whenever a flashback was triggered. In other words, we had visual proof that the effects of trauma are not necessarily different from and can overlap with the effects of physical lesions like strokes. All trauma is pre-verbal. Shakespeare captures this state of speechless terror in Macbeth after the murdered king's body is discovered. Quote, "Oh, horror, horror, tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee. Confusion now hath made his masterpiece," end quote. Under extreme conditions, people may scream obscenities, call for their mothers, howl in terror, or simply shut down. Victims of assaults and accidents sit mute and frozen in emergency rooms. Traumatized children, quote unquote, lose their tongues and refuse to speak. Photographs of combat soldiers show hollow-eyed men staring mutely into a void. Even years later, traumatized people often have enormous difficulty telling other people what has happened to them. Their bodies re-experience terror, rage, and helplessness, as well as the impulse to fight or flee. But these feelings are almost impossible to articulate. Trauma by nature drives us to the edge of comprehension, cutting us off from language based on common experience or an imaginable past. This doesn't mean that people can't talk about a tragedy that has befallen them. Sooner or later, most survivors, like the veterans in Chapter 1, come up with what many of them call their quote-unquote cover story. That offers some explanation for their symptoms and behavior for public consumption. These stories, however, rarely capture the inner truth of the experience. It is enormously difficult to organize one's traumatic experiences into a coherent account, a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even a seasoned reporter like the famed CBS correspondent Ed Morrow struggled to convey the atrocities he saw when the Nazi concentration camp Buchenwald was liberated in 1945. Quote, I pray you believe what I have said. I report what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words. End quote. When words fail, haunting images capture the experience and return as nightmares and flashbacks. In contrast to the deactivation of Broca's area, another region, Brodmann's area 19, lit up in our participants. This is a region in the visual cortex that registers images when they first enter the brain. We were surprised to see brain activation in this area so long after the original experience of the trauma. Under ordinary conditions, raw images registered in Area 19 are rapidly diffused to other brain areas that interpret the meaning of what has been seen. Once again, we were witnessing a brain region rekindled as if the trauma were actually occurring. As we will see in chapter 12, which discusses memory, other unprocessed sense fragments like trauma like sounds and smells and physical sensations are also registered separately from the story itself. Similar sensations often trigger a flashback that brings them back into consciousness, apparently unmodified by the passage of time. And now we're going to a new section called Shifting to One Side of the Brain. The scan also reveals that during flashbacks, our subject's brains lit up only on the right side. Today, there's a huge body of scientific and popular literature about the difference between the right and left brains. Back in the early 90s, I had heard that some people had begun to divide the world between left brainers, rational, logical people, and right brainers, the intuitive, artistic ones. But I hadn't paid much attention to this idea. However, our scans clearly showed that images of past trauma activate the right hemisphere of the brain and deactivate the left. We now know that the two halves of the brain do speak different languages. The right is intuitive, emotional, visual, spatial, and tactual, and the left is linguistic, sequential, and analytical. While the left half of the brain does all the talking, the right half of the brain carries the music of experience. It communicates through facial expressions and body languages by making the sounds of love and sorrow, by singing, swearing, crying, dancing, or mimicking. The right brain is the first to develop in the womb, and it carries the nonverbal communication between mothers and infants. We know the left hemisphere has come online when children start to understand language and learn how to speak. This enables them to name things, compare them, understand their interrelations, and begin to communicate their own unique, subjective experiences to others. The right and left sides of the brain also process the imprints of the past in dramatically different ways. The left brain remembers facts, statistics, and the vocabulary of events. We call on it to explain our experiences and put them in order. The right brain stores memories of sound, touch, smell, and the emotions they evoke. It reacts automatically to voices, facial features, and gestures, and places experiences experienced in the past. What it recalls feels like intuitive truth, the way things are. Even as we enumerate a loved one's virtues to a friend, our feelings may be deeply stirred by how her face recalls the aunt we loved at age 4. Under ordinary circumstances, the two sides of the brain work together more or less smoothly, even in people who might be said to favor one side over the other. However, having one side of the other shut down, even temporarily, or having one side cut off entirely, as sometimes happened in early brain surgery, is disabling. Deactivation of the left hemisphere has a direct impact on the capacity to organize experience into logical sequences and to translate our shifting feelings and perceptions into words. Broca's area, which blacks out during flashbacks, is on the left side. Without sequencing, we can't identify cause and effect, grasp the long-term effects of our actions, or create coherent plans for the future. People who are very upset sometimes say they are, quote unquote, losing their minds. In technical terms, they are experiencing the loss of executive functioning. When something reminds traumatized people of the past, their right brain reacts as if the traumatic event were happening in the present. But because their left brain is not working very well, They might not be aware that they are re-experiencing and reenacting the past. They are just furious, terrified, enraged, ashamed, or frozen. After the emotional storm passes, they may look for something or somebody to blame for it. They behaved the way they did because you were 10 minutes late, or because you burned the potatoes, or because you, quote unquote, never listened to me. Of course, most of us have done this from time to time, but when we cool down, we hopefully admit our mistake. Trauma interferes with this kind of awareness, and over time, our research demonstrated why. So now we are in a new section called Stuck in Fight or Flight. What had happened to Marcia in the scanner gradually started to make sense. 13 years after her tragedy, we had activated the sensations, the sounds, and images from the accident. They were still stored in her memory. When these sensations came to the surface, they activated her alarm system, which caused her to react as if she were in the hospital being told that her daughter had died. The passage of 13 years was erased. Her sharply increased heart rate and blood pressure readings reflected her physiological state of frantic harm. Adrenaline is one of the hormones that are critical to help us fight back or flee in the face of danger. Increased adrenaline was responsible for our participants' dramatic rise in heart rate and blood pressure while listening to the trauma narrative. Under normal conditions, people react to a threat with a temporary increase in their stress hormones. As soon as the threat is over, the hormones dissipate and the body returns to normal. The stress hormones of traumatized people, in contrast, take much longer to return to baseline and spike quickly and disproportionately in response to mildly stressful stimuli. The insidious effects of constantly elevated stress hormones include memory and attention problems, irritability, and sleep disorders. They also contribute to many long-term health issues, depending on which body system is most vulnerable in a particular individual. We now know that there is another possible response to threat, which our scans aren't yet capable of measuring. Some people simply go into denial. Their bodies register the threat, but their conscious minds go on as if nothing has happened. However, even though the mind may learn to ignore the messages from the brain, the alarm signals don't stop. The emotional brain keeps working, and stress hormones keep sending signals to the muscles to tense for action and immobilize and collapse. The physical effects on the organs go on unabated until they demand notice when they are expressed as illness. Medications, drugs, and alcohol can also temporarily dull or obliterate unbearable sensations and feelings, but the body continues to keep the score. We can interpret what happened to Marcia in the scanner from several different perspectives, each of which has implications for treatment. We can focus on the neurochemical and physiological disruptions that were so evident and make a case that she is suffering from a biochemical imbalance that is reactivated whenever she is reminded of her daughter's death. We might then search for a drug or a combination of drugs that would damp down the reaction or, in the best case, restore her chemical equilibrium. Based on the results of our scans, some of my colleagues at MGH began investigating drugs that might make people less responsive to the effects of elevated adrenaline. We can also make a strong case that Marcia is hypersensitized to her memories of the past, and that the best treatment would be some form of desensitization. After repeatedly rehearsing the details of the trauma with a therapist, her biological responses might become muted so that she could realize and remember that, quote unquote, that was then and this is now. Rather than reliving the experience over and over. For 100 years or more, every textbook of psychology and psychotherapy has advised that some method of talking about distressing feelings can resolve them. However, as we've seen, the experience of trauma itself gets in the way of being able to do that. No matter how much insight and understanding we develop, the rational brain is basically impotent to talk the emotional brain out of its own reality. I am continually impressed by how difficult it is for people who have gone through the unspeakable to convey the essence of their experience. It is so much easier for them to talk about what has been done to them, to tell a story of victimization and revenge, than to notice, feel, and put into words the reality of their internal experience. Our scans have revealed how their dread persisted and could be triggered by multiple aspects of daily experience. They had not integrated their experience into the ongoing stream of their life. They continued to be, quote unquote, there, and did not know how to be, quote unquote, here, fully alive in the present. 3 years after being a participant in our study, Marcia came to me as a patient. I successfully treated her with EMDR, the subject of chapter 15. All right, and we are moving on to part 2 of the book. It's called This Is Your Brain on Trauma. And we are starting chapter 4 as well. And chapter 4 begins with a quote from Roger Sperry. Prior to the advent of brain, there was no color and no sound in the universe, nor was there any flavor or aroma, and probably little sense and no feeling or emotion. Before brains, the universe was also free of pain and anxiety. All right, starting the chapter. On September 11, 2001, 5-year-old Noam Saul witnessed the first passenger plane slam into the World Trade Center from the windows of his first grade classroom at PS 234, less than 1,500 feet away. The old plane narrative there. That I could go on about that, but I'm definitely not going to. Okay, he and his classmates ran with their teacher down the stairs to the lobby, where most of them were reunited with parents who had dropped them off at school just moments earlier. Noam, his older brother, and their dad were 3 of the tens of thousands of people who ran for their lives through the rubble, ash, and smoke of Lower Manhattan that morning. 10 days later, I visited his family, who were friends of mine, and that evening his parents and I went for a walk in the eerie darkness through the still smoking pit of Tower 1, where Tower 1 once stood, making our way among the rescue crews who were working around the clock under the blazing Klieg of lights. When we returned home, Noam was still awake, and he showed me a picture that he had drawn at 9 a.m. on September 12th. The drawing depicted what he had seen the day before: a plane slamming into the tower, a ball of fire, firefighters, and people jumping from the tower's windows. But at the bottom of the picture, he had drawn something else, a black circle at the foot of the buildings. I had no idea what it was, so I asked him. "A trampoline," he replied. "What was a trampoline doing there?" Noam explained. "So that the next time when people have to jump, they will be safe." I was stunned. This 5-year-old boy, a witness to unspeakable mayhem and disaster just 24 hours before he had made this drawing, had used his imagination to process what he had seen and begin to go on with his life. Noam was fortunate. His entire family was unharmed. He had grown up surrounded by love, and he was able to grasp that the tragedy they had witnessed had come to an end. During disasters, young children usually take their cues from their parents. As long as their caregivers remain calm and responsive to their needs, they often survive terrible events without serious psychological scars. But Noam's experience allows us to see and outline 2 critical aspects of the adaptive response to threat that is basic to human survival. At the time the disaster occurred, he was able to take an active role by running away from it, thus becoming an agent in his own rescue. And once he had reached the safety of home, the alarm bells in his brain and body quieted. This freed his mind to make sense of what had happened and even to imagine a creative alternative to what he had seen, a life-saving trampoline. In contrast to Noam, traumatized people become stopped in their growth because they can't integrate new experiences into their lives. I was very moved when the veterans of Patton's Army gave me a World War II Army issue watch for Christmas, but it was a sad memento of the year their lives had effectively stopped, 1944. Being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on, unchanged and immutable, as every new encounter or event is contaminated by the past. After trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. The survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos at the expense of spontaneous involvement in their life. These attempts to maintain control over unbearable physiological reactions can result in a whole range of physical symptoms, including fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and other autoimmune diseases. This explains why it is critical for trauma treatment to engage the entire system or the entire organism, body, mind, and brain. So there's a drawing here from Noam. It says 5-year-old Noam's drawing made after he witnessed the World Trade Center attack on 9/11. He reproduced the image that haunted so many survivors, people jumping to escape from the inferno, but with a life-saving addition, a trampoline at the bottom of the collapsing building. All right, so this is his little Noam's picture here. And I'm guessing that right there is the little trampoline. Okey doke. And okay, that's the end of this section. So, okay, I need to read this first. Okay, moving on to the next section. Organized to survive. This illustration on page 53 shows the whole body response to threat. When the brain's alarm system is turned on, it automatically triggers pre-programmed physical escape plans in the oldest parts of the brain. As in other animals, the nerves and chemicals that make up our basic brain structure have a direct connection with our body. When the old brain takes over, it partially shuts down the higher brain, our conscious mind, and prepares the body to run, hide, fight, or on occasion freeze. By the time we are fully aware of our situation, our body may already be on the move. If the fight, flight, freeze response is successful and we escape the danger, we recover our internal equilibrium and gradually, quote unquote, regain our senses. If for some reason the normal response is blocked, for example, when people are held down, trapped, or otherwise prevented from taking effective action, be it in a war zone, a car accident, domestic violence, or rape, the brain keeps secreting stress chemicals, and the brain's electrical circuits continue to fire in vain. Long after the actual event has passed, the brain may keep sending signals to the body to escape a threat that no longer exists. Since at least 1989, when the French psychologist Pierre Genet published the first scientific account of traumatic stress, it has been recognized that trauma survivors are prone to, quote unquote, continue the action, or rather the futile attempt at action, which began when the thing happened. Being able to move and do something to protect oneself is a critical factor in determining whether or not a horrible experience will leave long-lasting scars. In this chapter, I'm going to go deeper into the brain's response to trauma. The more neuroscience discovers about the brain, the more we realize it is a vast network of interconnected parts organized to help us survive and flourish. Knowing how these parts work together is essential to understanding how trauma affects every part of the human organism and can serve as an indispensable guide to resolving traumatic stress. So I'm going to go back to page 53 here and show you this depiction. Underneath it says, trauma affects the entire human organism, body, mind, and brain. In PTSD, the body continues to defend against a threat that belongs to the past. Healing from PTSD means being able to terminate this continued stress mobilization and restore the entire organism to safety. So it's showing different parts of the brain, and it's showing this guy in a tensed like response stance kind of. So let's start with the top one. So here, let me scoot closer. So here we've got the brainstem and the pituitary gland here. And this front part says, can we focus? Disengaged executive functioning. So up here in the frontal lobe of the brain, there's destabilization there with brain function. And then down here, starting from the head and down, so the facial muscles communicating the need for defense and protection, that is affected negatively, as they mentioned before, or as the author mentioned a few pages ago, how verbal response can be stunted during trauma. For the thyroid, that is also shut down right here. So that the pituitary gland, when that's affected, it also affects the thyroid. The next part, to the heart, lungs, larynx, increased oxygen for fight, flight. So that just makes sense when we are in a stress response or responding to trauma. We usually have increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, which is going to affect our cardiac cycle, and it's going to affect our rate of respiration. Okay, to the GI tract, slowing down viscera collapse. Slowing down. I mean, I'm just guessing that means like sometimes it can even mean loss of control of the bowels. Maybe because the blood is rushing to other places in the body that it's taken away from the GI tract, so digestion is slowed. I'm not quite sure what that totally means, but I don't think it's super important right now. And then to the adrenal glands, release of stress hormones. So that's going to be like adrenaline, cortisol, things that are going to help prep us for survival mode. All right. And then there's pictures on this next page too that go with this organized to survive section that I just finished reading. It says effective action versus immobilization. Effective action, the result of fight, flight, ends the threat. Immobilization keeps the body in a state of inescapable shock and learned helplessness. Faced with danger, people automatically secrete stress hormones to fuel resistance and escape. Brain and body are programmed to run for home where safety can be restored and stress hormones can come to rest. And these strapped down men who are being evacuated far from home after Hurricane Katrina, stress hormone levels remain elevated and are turned against the survivors, stimulating ongoing fear, depression, rage, and physical disease. So you see in this first picture, there are people, it looks like there's a bomb going off back behind them, and they're able to run and be active in their survival here. In this next picture, there's survivors from Hurricane Katrina that are being loaded on some type of aircraft carrier, and they're like strapped down. So I would think that people in this type of natural disaster situation would already be pretty stressed out. So being strapped down and unable to move would probably just heighten and perpetuate that feeling, as they're saying in this book. So I could only imagine. And then even if they, especially if they have claustrophobia or something like that, and they're strapped in and they have no idea where they're going. Yeah. Okay. So this next section, we only have a couple more pages, you all, so we are almost done with week 3. Okay, this next section is the brain from bottom to top. The most important job of the brain is to ensure our survival, even under the most miserable conditions. Everything else is secondary. In order to do that, the brain needs to, 1, generate internal signals that register what our bodies need, such as food, rest, protection, sex, and shelter. 2, create a map of the world to point us where to go to satisfy these needs. 3, generate the necessary energy and actions to get us there. 4, warn us of dangers and opportunities along the way. And 5, adjust our actions based on the requirements of the moment. And since we human beings are mammals, creatures that can only survive and thrive in groups, all of these imperatives require coordination and collaboration. Psychological problems occur when our internal signals don't work, when our maps don't lead us where we need to go, when we are too paralyzed to move, when our actions do not correspond to our needs, or when our relationships break down. Every brain structure that I discuss has a role to play in these essential functions. And as we will see, trauma can interfere with every one of them. Our rational cognitive brain is actually the youngest part of the brain and occupies only 30% of the area inside our skull. The rational brain is primarily concerned with the world outside us. The Understanding how things and people work and figuring out how to accomplish our goals, manage our time, and sequence our actions. Beneath the rational brain lie two evolutionarily older and to some degree separate brains, which are in charge of everything else. The moment by moment registration and the management of our body's physiology and the identification of comfort, safety, threat, hunger, fatigue, desire, longing, excitement, pleasure, and pain. The brain is built from the bottom up. It develops level by level within every child in the womb, just as it did in the course of evolution. The most primitive part, the part that is already online when we are born, is the ancient animal brain, often called the reptilian brain. It is located in the brainstem just above the place where our spinal cord enters the skull. The reptilian brain is responsible for all of the things that newborn babies can do: eat, sleep, wake, cry, breathe, feel temperature, hunger, wetness, and pain, and rid the body of toxins by urinating and defecating. The brainstem and the hypothalamus, which sits directly above it, together control the energy levels of the body. They coordinate the functioning of the heart and lungs and also the endocrine and immune systems, ensuring that these basic life-sustaining systems are maintained within the relatively stable internal balance known as homeostasis. Breathing, eating, sleeping, pooping, and peeing are so fundamental that their significance is easily neglected when we're considering the complexities of mind and behavior. However, if your sleep is disturbed, or your bowels don't work, or if you always feel hungry, or if being touched makes you want to scream, as is often the case with traumatized children and as adults, the entire organism is thrown into disequilibrium. It is amazing how many psychological problems involve difficulties with sleep, appetite, touch, digestion, and arousal. Any effective treatment for trauma has to address these basic housekeeping functions of the body. Right above the reptilian brain is the limbic system. It's also known as the mammalian brain, because all animals that live in groups and nurture their young possess this one. Development of this part of the brain truly takes off after a baby is born. It is the seat of the emotions, the monitor of danger, the judge of what is pleasurable or scary, the arbiter of what is or is not important for survival purposes. It is also a central command post for coping with the challenges of living within our complex social networks. The limbic system is shaped in response to experience, in partnership with the infant's own genetic makeup and inborn temperament. As all parents of more than one child quickly notice, babies differ from birth in the intensity and nature of their reactions to similar events. Whatever happens to a baby contributes to the emotional and perceptual map of the world that its developing brain creates. As my colleague Bruce Perry explains it, the brain is formed in a use-dependent manner. This is another way of describing neuroplasticity. The relevant recent, oh my gosh, okay. Starting over, this is another way of describing neuroplasticity, the relatively recent discovery that neurons that quote unquote fire together wire together. When a circuit fires repeatedly, it can become a default setting, the response most likely to occur. If you feel safe and loved, your brain becomes specialized in exploration, play, and cooperation. If you are frightened and unwanted, it specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment. As toddlers and infants, we learn about the world by moving, grabbing, and crawling, and by discovering what happens when we cry, smile, or protest. We are constantly experimenting with our surroundings. How do our interactions change the way our bodies feel? Attend any 2-year-old's birthday party and notice how little Kimberly will engage with you, play with you, flirt with you without any need for language. These early explorations shape the limbic structures devoted to emotions and memory, but these structures can also be significantly modified by later experiences. For the better, by a close friendship or a beautiful first love, for example, or for the worse, by a violent assault, relentless bullying, or neglect. Taken together, the reptilian brain and limbic system make up what I'll call the quote unquote emotional brain throughout this book. The emotional brain is at the heart of the central nervous system, and its key task is to look out for your welfare. If it detects danger or a special opportunities, such as a promising partner, it alerts you by releasing a squirt of hormones. The resulting visceral sensations, ranging from mild queasiness to the grip of panic in your chest, will interfere with whatever your mind is currently focused on and get you moving physically and mentally in a different direction. Even at their most subtle, these sensations have a huge influence on the small and large decisions we make throughout our lives. What we choose to eat, where we like to sleep and with whom, what music we prefer, whether we like to garden or sing in a choir, and whom we befriend and whom we detest. The emotional brain's cellular organization and biochemistry are simpler than those of the neocortex, our rational brain, and it assesses incoming information in a more global way. As a result, it jumps to conclusions based on rough similarities, in contrast with the rational brain, which is organized to sort through a complex set of options. The textbook example is leaping back in terror when you see a snake, only to realize that it's just a coiled rope. The emotional brain initiates pre-programmed escape plans like the fight or flight responses. These muscular and physiological reactions are automatic, set in motion without any thought or planning on our part, leaving our conscious, rational capacities to catch up later, often well after the threat is over. Finally, we reach the top layer of the brain, the neocortex. We share this outer layer with other mammals, but it is much thicker in us humans. In the second year of life, the frontal lobes, which make up the bulk of our neocortex, begin to develop at a rapid pace. The ancient philosophers called 7 years the quote unquote age of reason. For us, first grade is the prelude of things to come, a life organized around frontal lobe capacities, sitting still, keeping sphincters in check, being able to use words rather than acting out, and understanding abstract and symbolic ideas. Planning for tomorrow and being in tune with the teachers and classmates. The frontal lobes are responsible for the qualities that make us unique within the animal kingdom. They enable us to use language and abstract thought. They give us our ability to absorb and integrate vast amounts of information and attach meaning to it. Despite our excitement about the linguistic effects of chimpanzees and rhesus monkeys, only human beings command the words and symbols necessary to create the communal, spiritual, and historical contexts that shape our lives. The frontal lobes allow us to plan and reflect, to imagine and play out future scenarios. They help us to predict what will happen if we take one action, like applying for a new job, or neglect another, not paying the rent. They make choice possible and underlie our astonishing creativity. Generations of frontal lobes working in close collaboration have created culture, which got us from dugout canoes, horse-drawn carriages, and letters to jet planes, hybrid cars, and email. They also gave us Noam's life-saving trampoline. All right, so this is about to be our last section for today. Okay. And this is called Mirroring Each Other, Interpersonal Neurobiology. Crucial for understanding trauma, the frontal lobes are also the seat of empathy, our ability to feel into someone else. One of the truly sensational discoveries of modern neuroscience took place in 1994, when in a lucky accident, a group of Italian scientists identified specialized cells in the neocortex that came to be known as mirror neurons. The researchers had attached electrodes to individual neurons in a monkey's premotor area, then set up a computer to monitor precisely which neurons fired when the monkey picked up a peanut or grasped a banana. At one point, an experimenter was putting food pellets into a box when he looked up at the computer. The monkey's brain cells were firing at the exact location where the motor command neurons were located. But the monkey wasn't eating or moving. He was watching the researcher, and his brain was vicariously mirroring the researcher's actions. Numerous other experiments followed around the world, and it soon became clear that the mirror neurons explained many previously unexplainable aspects of the mind, such as empathy, imitation, synchrony, and even the development of language. One writer compared mirror neurons to neural Wi-Fi. We pick up not only another's person's movement, but her emotional state and intentions as well. When people are in sync with each other, they tend to stand or sit similar ways, and their voices take on the same rhythms. But our mirror neurons also make us vulnerable to others' negativity, so that we respond to their anger with fury or are dragged down by their depression. I'll have more to say about mirror neurons later in this book, because trauma almost invariably involves not being seen, not being mirrored, and not being taken into account. Treatment needs to reactivate the capacity to safely mirror and be mirrored by others, but also to resist being hijacked by others' negative emotions. As anybody who has worked with brain damaged people or taken care of demented parents has learned the hard way, well-functioning frontal lobes are crucial for harmonious relationships with our fellow humans. Realizing that other people can think and feel differently from us is a huge developmental step for 2- and 3-year-olds. They learn to understand others' motives so they can adapt and stay safe in groups that have different perceptions, expectations, and values. Without flexible, active frontal lobes, people become creatures of habit, and the relationships become superficial and routine. Invention and innovation, discovery and wonder, all are lacking. Our frontal lobes can also sometimes, but not always, stop us from doing things that will embarrass us or hurt others. We don't have to eat every time we're hungry, kiss anybody who rouses our desires, or blow up every time we're angry. But it is exactly on that edge between impulse and acceptable behavior where most of our troubles begin. The more intense the visceral sensory input from the emotional brain, the less capacity the rational brain has to put a damper on it. Okay, and that is the end of week 3. However, I'm going to show you this depiction here. This is the triune 3-part brain. The brain develops from the bottom up. The reptilian brain develops in the womb and organizes basic life-sustaining functions. It is highly responsive to threat throughout our entire lifespan. So at the brainstem here, it shows basic housekeeping, arousal, sleep, wake, hunger, satiation, and breathing chemical balance. So these are the functions that the reptilian brain down here near the brainstem and the medulla oblongata and the pituitary gland down there. Okay, then the limbic system is organized mainly during the first 6 years of life, but continues to evolve in a use-dependent manner. Trauma can have a major impact on its functioning throughout life. Okay, so the limbic brain, it says map of relation between the organism and surrounding, emotional relevance, and categorization perception. So here's the limbic brain here in this area. And then the top part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, it develops last and also is affected by trauma exposure, including being unable to filter out irrelevant information. Throughout life, it is vulnerable to go offline in response to threat. So some of the functions are planning and anticipation, sense of time and context, inhibition of inappropriate actions, and empathetic understanding here in the prefrontal cortex. So this section here, and this section here as well. All right, you all, that is the end of weekend book club for week 3. Thank you all for joining. And if you're enjoying this video and this book, please remember to like the videos. If you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe to my channel if you resonate with my content. It helps the YouTube algorithm to pick up the videos that I put out and to help get those messages forward in front of more people. I've mentioned before, my channel is not about me. It's about the messages that I'm relaying from spirit to you. And it's all about helping people alchemize and change their lives and do shadow work and just heal the deepest, darkest wounds within their souls and their hearts and their minds and their bodies. It's about well-rounded health. And yeah, like the more that you're liking the videos and sharing them and commenting, the more YouTube's going to pick that up and put the messages out in front of more people. So thank you all for being here with me. Thank you for helping me get to 500 subscribers. I'm over 500 now. I'm creeping closer to 600. So my next goal is 1,000. Thank you for helping me get my community board. Really interesting because I thought I got that at 1,000 subscribers, but I said something in my self-work Saturday video last Saturday, and then I got home from where I was and I had a community board. It was really strange. It was like a gift from spirit. So again, thank you all so much for being here. What else? Oh yeah. So one more time, if you're looking for tarot reads, my booking link is down below. Also, I do have links down below if you would like to donate to the channel or tip me. That would be greatly appreciated. And I thank you to the people who are already donating and helping to support the channel, because this is what I do full-time, tarot reading, and then also doing research to get these videos and the content out there to help with healing people. So your support is greatly appreciated. And yeah, I think that's it for today. All right, you all. Thank you so much again for being here. You are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and loved. I love you. I love you. I love you. And I will see you soon. Bye. Every day is a gift.